Good evening and welcome to the MarshStream, your solo performance broadcasting platform. I'm Kristen Scheel for The Marsh, and I'd like to welcome you to Solo Arts Heal with Gail Schickley. The Marsh brings you free programming every night of the week. Please support our performers and live theater by contributing to our Marsh tip jar, which will be linked to the chat throughout the evening. We'd like to welcome our YouTube viewers as well. And if you haven't already, please consider becoming a subscriber of our channel, The MarshStream, to be notified of shows as they go live. We are so grateful that you chose to be with us this evening, and we hope that you will please consider becoming a sustaining member of The Marsh. All this and more can be found on our website at themarsh.org. Please join me in welcoming Gail Schickley, host of Solo Arts Heal.
Thanks always to the MarshStream for offering this diverse public platform for the benefit of communities everywhere. Tonight, Solo Arts Heal presents the Health Story Collaborative with founder Dr. Annie Brewster and storyteller Caroline Wright. But before we get into our storytelling, I'd like to take a moment to tell you about Solo Arts Heal. A year ago, we began a collective of solo artists whose shows embody the healing power of the arts through great storytelling as survivors and caregivers across a variety of physical and mental health challenges. And when COVID began, we were invited by one of these artists, the illustrious Stephanie Weissman, to tell these stories live on Solo Arts Heal on the new MarshStream platform to reach out to the community during this time of isolation. And through it, we discovered a world of communities because, well, we're on a worldwide platform now, so we learned our audience is every community because we all faced health challenges. We all need resources. And what better way than through great performance? Tonight, we offer you empowerment through the Health Story Collaborative, which reminds us you are not alone. Illness can be frightening, isolating, and disempowering, but it doesn't have to be this way. While obviously none of us chooses illness, we can choose how we handle the challenge. Telling our stories allows us to integrate illness into our lives and to incorporate it as part of who we are. Annie Brewster, founder of nonprofit Health Story Collaborative, is committed to harnessing the healing power of stories and empowering individuals and families facing health challenges. Tonight, we're joined by Annie and a courageous storyteller, Caroline Wright, who shares what it is to be a parent of two young children in the face of a life-threatening illness. What questions does Caroline grapple with? How does she care for herself and her children? What lessons has she learned? We'll hear from her in a little while. But first, we're going to meet Dr. Annie Brewster. Let me tell you something about her. Annie is an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School and a practicing internist at Massachusetts General Hospital, Boston. She is also a patient, diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in 2001. She's been collecting and sharing patient stories since 2010. In 2013, she founded Health Story Collaborative, committed to empowering patients and their loved ones, building community, strengthening patient-provider connections, and ultimately transforming healthcare through storytelling. Her work has been published on the WBUR Commonwealth blog, NPR.org, the New York Times Well blog, and the Boston Globe and Miss Focus magazine, and other things that we'll maybe talk a little bit about. Ladies and gentlemen, now please welcome Annie Brewster.
Thank you so much, Gail, and thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to end the day, a happy day this way with all of you. So I want to thank MarshStream and Solo Arts Heal, and I love what your organizations are doing, and there's a lot of alignment. So I am just going to be brief to give a little context, but the star of the show tonight is really Caroline Wright, so I want to make sure that we save most of the time for her story. But I'll tell you briefly about my background and how Health Story Collaborative came to be. So as Gail said, I'm a physician practicing still in internal medicine. I'm also a patient living with MS since 2001, so for quite a while now. And I'd say my true passion is running Health Story Collaborative. So we are a small organization based in Boston, and we really are focused on creating time and space for story sharing in healthcare, because really as a patient and as a provider, what I've realized is that there's not enough honoring of the stories and not enough quality listening in medicine today. It tends to be more of a economic model, and we're focused more on curing in the hospital setting and less on healing. And so we believe in the healing power of stories, both for the storytellers and for the listeners. And there's a great deal of research actually that supports that. So all of our programming is grounded in that research. I work very closely with a psychologist named Jonathan Adler, who's not with us tonight, but he is fantastic collaborator, and his field is narrative psychology and specifically the health benefits of narrative. So his work really grounds a lot of our programs, and I just want to give a shout out to him. He also has a theater background, which is wonderful. So I think we really need to have stories more than ever now in this time, this strange year of pandemic and divisiveness, because stories not only help us individually integrate challenging experiences and help us to heal, but also help us as communities to heal collectively. And so I think this time and space that we're creating is very special and important. So I thank you for that. What you're going to see tonight with Caroline Wright is what we call healing story sessions. So we work closely with storytellers to write their stories using a narrative guide that we've designed based on the research, sort of helping to develop themes that we know to be empowering in our stories. And we've done it with people who are excellent writers like Caroline, who make it simple. We've done it with people who can't read or write, and we've just adapted the project and done it orally, but gotten to the same place of helping people to develop a story that feels empowering and authentic, but also with an eye towards us helping them expand on the themes that we know are healing. And so we've done them in lots of locations, in private homes, in huge venues and auditoriums and hospitals. And since COVID, we've been doing them virtually. So there's something really special that happens with community when there's a story exchange going on. And I think it can still happen virtually. And so my hope tonight is that the audience will engage in that. When we think about stories, we think about them relationally, so that we are all in a constant web of stories influencing each other. So when Caroline shares her story tonight, how you respond and just having this experience will change her story going forward, and hearing her story will change your story, and so on. And so I just invite you to open yourselves to the experience, to see what resonates with you and what doesn't. We'll have some time at the end for a question and answer and to talk more to Caroline. I know Gail's going to tell you more about Caroline and introduce her, but I just wanted to first of all give a shout out to CaringBridge, which is the online platform for story journaling, who introduced me to Caroline. I've worked collaboratively with CaringBridge over the years, and as has Caroline. And so that was a wonderful connection. So I'm thankful for them. But meeting Caroline has been incredible. She's so inspiring, and I know that Gail will tell you more about her, and we'll hear from her, and then I'm happy to take questions and at the end tell you more about the research. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Annie. That's beautiful. And yes, I think without further ado, let me introduce Caroline, and we'll get to hear her story and learn more about it. And again, we really are looking for audience feedback and participation. Caroline Wright, 35, is a writer and a mother of two sons, aged 5 and 8. And she is living with glioblastoma, the most aggressive form of brain cancer, and was given a life expectancy of 1 year when she was diagnosed in 2017. She used to only write cookbooks, but also writes children's books with her sons in mind, including one called Lasting Love, about the possibility of her death. And now we're going to hear a story of Caroline's. And so please welcome Caroline Wright.
Hi, everyone. So thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here. I'm really appreciative of Annie and this space. It's very important to be able to tell stories. I agree. So thank you for letting me read mine. It is surreal to me that my body grew both my cancer and my son's, forces of life and death that define me as a person, born from my own cells. Both are spaces in which my creative, boundless kind of love energy flow wildly. Getting sick, I've come to own I don't do things like everyone else. which may equate to something other people would define as sanity. The best example to illustrate this are the stories surrounding both my sons' pregnancies, each as different as the incredible humans that resulted from them. I'll give you the short versions, don't worry. With Henry, my oldest, I didn't know I was pregnant until 3 months in. I had attributed skipped periods, heartburn, or wanting to take midday naps to training for a half marathon at the time, a major lifestyle change to a person whose every waking thought was about food. I peed on a stick during a break of unpacking my husband, Garth's belongings into a small apartment 1,500 miles away from our home in Brooklyn, and nearly passed out. When I told Garth, we stared at the ceiling fan for a while. See, at that moment, he had just accepted a 2-year job in Dallas. I was a television producer based in Brooklyn and figured that my being on the road with the food show I was working on meant that we weren't going to be sleeping in the same bed anyway. We would just meet during my time off and get ahead in our careers for a few years. Anyway, when I found out that I was pregnant, all that went out the window. As 20-somethings in Brooklyn, we were blindsided. I cried, then made a plan. I decided that since I was going to be on the road with this television show anyway, I could give up our apartment. If I gave up my apartment and moved our belongings into storage, which would make our move back to Brooklyn in 2 years easier anyway, I could save the $2,000 a month and pay off our debt, which I did. But I didn't expect that my boss would feel uncomfortable with a pregnant lady in the field. Now, because I was pregnant, I had to work in the office instead, researching future episodes. This is how I ended up homeless and pregnant in New York. It is also how the experience of my first pregnancy, unlike all of my mom friends, whose doting husbands were at every appointment, was alone until I flew to Dallas at 7 months pregnant. That's when I switched doctors, left my entire network of friends and loved ones, and moved to a city in which I knew no one. Then, of course, my sweet Henry arrived, and I was inundated with a whole new identity, gifted to me by this crying, squishy human I had to take care of 24 hours a day. See, I'm a little crazy, I tell you. So 3 years later with Theodore, I wanted to do everything differently. The upheaval of Henry's pregnancy, the weekly couch surfing, sleeping on friends' floors, on deflating air mattresses, and feeling like a beached whale, made me feel as though I'd earned a pampered pregnancy. I was in Dallas then, so being a pampered pregnant lady was an achievable goal. I had monthly prenatal massages. I took Henry to the gym every day, where I put him in free childcare while I leisurely strode upon an elliptical alongside other mom friends. It was a time in which I willfully tried on a different life, one in which I wasn't working constantly, to distract myself from missing the inspiration and family I'd left in Brooklyn. Didn't work. I was miserable. My pregnancy with Theodore, our second kid, made the fantasy of our return to Brooklyn unlikely. Some of our friends there had kids at that point, but I watched them struggle with their single child and make silly things work for the sake of affordability, like give their child a master bedroom with a door and the parents would live in the living room, never able to have anyone in their home out of embarrassment. This was a different level of crazy I wasn't prepared to commit to. So I asked my husband where he might be able to transfer within his job. He worked as a lawyer for the government after all. Seattle came up on the list. I loved imagining raising 2 boys in the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, hiking and camping in the sweaters I knit for them while bored in Dallas. With a 3-day-old Theodore in my arms and a toddler in tow, a moving truck came to our rental house in Dallas to take our things across the country to our new life, one that would fit a family of 4. Crazy. Now, do you see what I'm saying? But I would move mountains for my children. Life in Seattle wasn't less crazy. In the first 9 months of living there, we bought a dilapidated 1906 home at the height of the housing market, and I undertook its full-scale renovation while writing my 3rd cookbook that required me to travel to Spain and promoting my 2nd cookbook and, nursing a baby on my body and his older brother caught in a whirlwind in my arms. So it was no surprise that in December of 2016, The month in which I handed in the manuscript of my third and most ambitious cookbook, I started to get headaches. I never had a headache before, so I went to the doctor. I filled out all kinds of forms, worksheets to determine where I landed on scales for depression and anxiety. It all pointed to stress, this cultivation of craziness I'd grown comfortable with. My doctor explained that headaches are common to arise in stressed mothers in their early 30s and went on to confirm the pain patterns of my headaches. Migraines, she thought. Bands of pain here. Not really, I said. I had a really bad one, a sinus one maybe, right in the corner of my right eye. She told me that that was unusual and said it was probably nothing, but we should schedule an MRI just in case. On February 19th, 2017, I went in for that seemingly routine MRI. I drove myself because Garth was at work. We didn't have family in town, and it seemed like a routine thing. I remember feeling disoriented, confused about how to get to the hospital, despite the robotic voice coming from my phone, taking wrong turns over and over and blaming being new to the neighborhood. I finally made it to the correct parking deck. Once I was all checked in and naked, except for the loose pajamas to which I'd been assigned, the tech found me and I made jokes as she brought me to my machine. We laughed as I laid down. I was just taking in the newness of the whole thing. When the hammering and the clanging started, I was shocked. I hadn't expected the jarring experience of being trapped in a tube with a jackhammer. When the tech returned to add contrast to my IV, I asked her with sincerity masked as a joke whether it was designed to trigger terrible headaches, if she could see them on the screen. She mumbled, and I was sucked back inside. That MRI revealed a 7-centimeter tumor in the frontal lobe of my brain. The constant headaches I was experiencing were due to the demands of its size in relation to the available space within my skull. The disorientation I had been experiencing more and more frequently as I approached my MRI, sometimes spanning full days, had been seizures. The week that followed involved a choreographed series of transformations, phone calls that turned into meetings, that turned into a surgery. I went from being a full-time mother to being a full-time patient. My parents moved from Florida to Seattle. This week was punctuated by a stunning finale that no one expected, a diagnosis of the deadliest brain cancer possible, the one that I was about 30 years too young to worry about, a glioblastoma. I went home from the appointment stunned by my body like I had been 4 years before. Instead of concealing and nurturing life, it had been concealing and nurturing death. I crawled into bed and wrote goodbye letters to my sons that painted vast landscapes of my love for them, knowing no language could ever be enough, and fell down the dark hole of what ifs, swallowed by the seeming impossibility of it all. I heard the boys' shrieks from under my door, signs of life outside my bedroom. I knew I had to join them. If I only had a year left to live, like my doctors had said, I didn't want to spend it in bed behind a closed door. Once again, I cried, and I made a plan. The next day, I walked away from my third cookbook, calling upon a ghostwriter to finish off the edits, and unfortunately, the remainder of my advance. I decided to do something, everything I could. So, at an intersection of desperation and craziness, I spoke to a medical clairvoyant on the phone. She was someone my parents had spoken to a few years before at an intersection of their own desperation and craziness. Maybe it's hereditary. The clairvoyant told me a lot of helpful ideas and thoughts that I briefly shrouded in doubt, simple ones like incorporating yoga into my life, deep breathing, and drinking more water. She had said some things I wanted to believe, specifically that I wasn't going to die from this, so I figured I had to take the whole lot of what she said seriously. I didn't have anything to lose at that point anyway, so I reoriented my life immediately, inspired by her recommendations. I toned every aspect of my life down. I slept more, ate better, and prioritized calmness and self-care for the first time in my life. Meanwhile, Garth and I didn't know what to say to our sons. Our only friend in Seattle gave us a book for parents facing terminal illness. It advised telling the whole truth in a developmentally appropriate way and never to push conversations before the child was ready to hear them. In our house, we were always having fragmented conversations. Harrowing connections could happen at random moments. Once, I remember Henry, who had grown into a particularly articulate and precocious then 4-year-old, asked me over breakfast who would raise him. It was shocking to hear, to read the vulnerability on his face. I tried not to flinch. I told him that the same people would raise him whether I lived or died, and that he is so lucky to have so much love in his life. Mine wouldn't leave him, even if my body stopped fighting. In addition to our one parenting book and inspired by the clairvoyance vision, I consider the wisdom that was hidden around me, inside me, and looked everywhere for it. Advice seemed to come from everywhere. It generally came with soup. I took from it what resonated with me. I researched hunches I had as a food professional. And by the time of my 33rd birthday, which at that point was only a few days later, I didn't eat sugar, chocolate, or gluten, so I didn't dig into my birthday cake. My philosophy was to be as gentle on my body as possible, to do all the things that made me feel more alive, more like me. So I started gentle yoga a few times a week, ate a diet that made me feel even keeled and strong in ways I had never experienced in my life before then. And I wrote a lot. I wrote for my sons on my blog that I had set up, all of my deepest thoughts and answers to questions they might have someday about my experience, especially with Theodore in mind, as I assumed that he, as a baby, wouldn't remember me at all. I wrote so they would know the shape of my fighting, regardless of the outcome. With this regimen, these philosophical shifts to my life, I grew strong, even through daily radiation and chemo. One day, I woke up with an idea for a different book altogether for them, one to take care of their questions in the form they are now as little boys, a picture book. An idea sprung to mind that illustrated what we were already telling the boys from our completely open, non-religious perspective, that whether or not mommy's body survives, my love is permanent and will shape them forever. I scribbled down the text of the book in 20 minutes, set up a meeting with a painter I met through my son's preschool with a unique talent in watercolor named Willow. Just like that, I had a book to make, and I lived even more fully in the part of me that cancer couldn't touch. And just like that, I didn't worry anymore about what my career looked like. I was still an author, but of books I never thought I'd write, ones I couldn't plan for. That book came out in August 2019 from Random House. They call it Lasting Love, which is the perfect title. As I held it in my hands on its release date, over a year past the one my doctors told me I wouldn't see, I had clean scans and was the recipient of the descriptor miracle thrown out casually by my doctors. I realized that maybe my particular brand of crazy, that very one that defined my pregnancies and my cancer recovery roadmap as suggested by a clairvoyant, was actually just my way of making hope. That kind of hope that I see now I made for myself when no one could give it to me is now embedded into the shape of my full life, quirky as it is, but beautiful too. My life that holds in it with love and respect, alongside my sources of vitality, motherhood, and creativity, my possible death too. And don't worry, I'm still crazy and I do too much. I make 60 quarts of soup a week to run a soup club for the community that cooked for me while I was sick. I'm writing another cookbook and have 2 more books in the works, and try to keep up with Theodore as he scoots to preschool most mornings. All of this is lived around Henry's demanding soccer schedule, which I guess adds soccer mom to my list of roles, well after the one I found patient. I'm cracking open my life and telling the world about the joy I found in my cancer, the strength I found in myself through my diagnosis. I'm not safe by any means, but I also know that it isn't terribly different to anyone else I meet on the street. I'm capable of balance in ways I wasn't before. I am in love with my life in ways I wasn't before. And I taste food differently than I did before. I'm grateful for every moment held in this one right now, which is how I feel every single day. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. What a beautiful story, beautifully expressed. Thank you. I'm very moved, and I'm sure our audience is too, and I will look for feedback from the audience as well. I'd like to know the process that you went through in creating this story.
Well, Annie touched on it. Basically, I, through Caring Bridge, was set up with Annie, was told about the program, and she sent me this really helpful guideline. And yes, I am a writer, but really it was from her prompts and that I landed on the structure. And I thought of the device of talking, because it advised to tell other parts of your life that were not just the cancer. So that's why the stories of the pregnancies and things like to illustrate what my full life looks like. And then the cancer just sort of comes into that. But I think it just worked well, and we really felt that it was a good fit.
It's beautiful. There's so many great details about your family and the cancer itself. And you're completely well now.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, technically it's an incurable cancer. So they're very careful about the words they use, right? But I have been cancer free since then. I remain that way, which is like, it's never not a big deal for that, because it can come back, or like a new one could come, it's just a scary cancer. But so I'm grateful for every day.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's beautiful. We have we're going to have a more in-depth talk with Annie, and we've lots to talk about. But I want to take a moment right here to remind the audience that posted in the chat is the link to the tip jar, and your tax-deductible support is indeed needed and much appreciated to keep the MarshStream platform open to our communities during this time of isolation and theater closure. Also, we encourage your comments and questions, and our producers will help us keep an eye on that, also from YouTube, to our viewers there. The chat, I think, was closed during the performance. It's open now, so don't hold back, because this show begs your response. For instance, to the audience, how did hearing Caroline's story make you feel? And Caroline, maybe you yourself can answer that while we're waiting for some comments in writing that.
Yeah, it's well, certainly telling my story, telling it in front of new people, feeling their reactions. It's different, obviously, in person when you get like more of a sense of what how people were feeling. But it's so powerful because it's such a tender and vulnerable part of life that I feel like exposing it to other people and really letting them in, it makes you feel stronger and more capable and empowered. And because cancer, or any really life-threatening illness, it makes everybody feel things about their own lives. And so I feel like it's very isolating as a patient. You feel very shut off from people, and you feel like you're cast as this like dying person or whatever that means to someone else. And being able to tell my story means that no, I get to define what that looks like for me. And I get to tell you what my life is like. So you don't have to assume that I'm just like, withering away, because people who have cancer are also just people who have cancer, with full and rich lives, and they don't define themselves by it. I had like a crazy, amazing life before this crazy, amazing thing happened to me. So, yeah, that's how it feels.
Mm-hmm. And I like the idea of how it weaves everything in. So, all the happiness as well as the difficulties, and it's all part of one life. And that's really beautiful. I do have a message, first of all, from Stephanie Weissman, who says, "What a beautiful story. Thank you so much." And Kristen said, she was so interested in the words you use for your children when you explain what could have happened with your cancer. How did you come up with the words?
Well, like I said, we read a book. It's the title is something like uh, how to like through a parent's terminal illness. I'm sorry, I wish I had the title on me. I can see the cover. That doesn't help you. But basically, the advice is to tell the developmentally appropriate truth. So I would say, like mommy's going in. My son actually provided me with most of the words. When I was like struggling to try and explain it to them, he said, "Oh, okay." Henry said, "Well, so you have a weed in your brain. You have a weed in the garden of your brain." And I said, "Yes." And they're going to need to take it out. And so then that kind of became the language that we used. And I think that speaks to children are so intuitive and so capable. And actually, I've done a lot of work in this field because of this book. I think it's the adults. It's the adults who don't want to say what is happening because they don't want to admit it to themselves what's going on. But for me, it wasn't any different than just being a mom, right? You're just preparing, if it's going to rain later, you have to throw a jacket in the back of your car. Well, if I was going to die, I would want them to know so that I could prepare them for that. And so that I could, make sure that in every way that I could, that they knew how much I loved them. And if they had any questions, that I was preparing them for that. That's also why I wrote so much, is because though I was answering developmentally appropriate questions at the time, I didn't want their future selves, to look back on the situation and wish they had asked me something specific or whatever. So that was kind of my approach. But there's definitely prompts to dig into that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Did you see ways that your children were affected by the information?
Yes. I mean, it was terribly, terribly sad and shocking. And the piece that was most challenging, I think, was Henry, my oldest son. Even as I was doing better, and I was, losing weight, getting stronger. It was just so crazy. All of my doctors were like, "Yeah, you're in really intense chemo and radiation. We don't understand why your blood levels are so good and why you look so good." They're like, "We've never seen anyone get healthier in this situation." But it was because I was doing a crazy amount of self-care. I was very, very lucky to be able to do that. I stopped my life. But so it was hard with my kids, them watching that, and then Henry be like, "But you're all better now." And well, no, I'm still having to have these MRIs, and at the time, because of my diagnosis, because it's incurable and scary and everything, they don't give you hope at all. They don't tell you the success stories. They just exclusively gave me my prognosis, and just every time I would ask follow-up questions, feeling better, not believing that this was dying, I'd ask them and they'd be like, "Well, no, that's what we're expecting. You've had a slightly different trajectory than other people," but they would never give me any more information. Because there's no data, but there's not a lot of data of, I was already an outlier being so young. So it was challenging. And I actually took a lot of solace in that. So, with my kids, I basically just told them everything that I knew that they wanted to know.
Wonderful. We have a comment here from an Ariella who says, "I have a chronic illness myself and have 4 children and a new author. So your story just encouraged me to continue writing even in these painful days. You are an inspiration. I'm 43 and my children are now 12, 16, 20, and 21, she says.
Wow. Mm-hmm. That's amazing. Definitely keep writing. They will appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. And Kristen asked, do you find that the way you tell or edit this story changes over time, or do you stick to the text?
Well, I mean, I read it. This is my second time of reading it in public, or whatever we call this, public. And no, it's sort of evergreen for me. It's the story. It's it's the story of their pregnancies and my cancer. Those things are like fixtures. They happened that way. It's totally nuts story, but I guess I feel a little nuts. It's okay.
I know participants are asked to make sure to include details, accounts of key moments in your stories, which we certainly heard a lot of here. And I know your story tells it, but did you have, and I want to ask the audience too, about specific questions. Did you have a list of specific questions that you chose to address?
In writing the
More
story?
organic, yeah. And yeah.
No. I don't know, maybe because I had Annie's prompts, which were just like really helpful guidelines. And I bet if I was struggling, they were definitely like available to help and guide. But for me, no, as a writer, I just was telling like the details, like, which are so silly. Like even I think of them, and so many of them are just so silly. And it's just, there's such joy in recalling some of that stuff, just because like it's such a time and place, and like I just can't even imagine that life anymore. And especially now that I've changed my life, so drastically because of my cancer, like the Caroline who lived in New York is just like very different than the Caroline who lives in Seattle now. It's just so different. My life is very different. Sure. So just finding joy and recalling those details and weaving them together. That was sort of what I did.
Well, it was beautiful.
I could speak a little bit, Gail, to the prompts and how we structure it.
Very
so
good.
Yeah, so we ground, the research is really grounded in this concept called narrative identity. And that's really the belief that who we are is shaped by the meaning we make out of what happens to us in our lives, reflected in the stories we tell. So key points there for me are, we can't always control what happens to us, but we can control the meaning that we make out of what happens to us. And our stories can change over time. The scaffolding of this sort of narrative identity is shaped by usually like turning point moments. So high points, low points. We can't remember every little story of our lives. So it tends to be these big moments that form this scaffolding of our identity. And illness is one of those. It's been called a biographical disruption by a sociologist I like. And I think that's true. It's one of these moments where our stories sort of get disrupted and we have to rewrite them. And that can be really challenging, but it's also good for us to do that. So the other key point in the research, that's John Adler's work really, is that not all stories are created equal, so that actually there are certain themes in stories that have been clearly associated with positive mental health. And so in our prompts, we're trying to pull for those themes too. And the themes just briefly are the theme of agency, so feeling like you're in control, in the driver's seat to some extent. The theme of redemption, so when you can see something that's been challenging and find the silver linings in it. The theme of communion, so connection to other people, community, and then coherence, which is just this process of coming up with sort of a coherent story that holds all the different parts that you're trying to pull together. That's actually really good for us. And that is something that we get out of just going through the process of doing this. And then this accommodative processing. So there's assimilative processing where things happen to us that are little and we just assimilate them. And then there's accommodative processing where we have to sort of shift our lives to make sense of something that happens, shift our story to fit it in. That's like illness. And that's hard, but it's also psychologically really productive. So the way that our guide is structured is really sort of looking at illness as one of these turning point moments. So we ask a lot of prompts and specific details about sort of the before illness self, and then the moment of transition, the diagnosis, and then the after self. Keeping in mind that not everyone's story has a clear before and after and turning point. Some people were born with illness, so it doesn't always fit that mold, but we're looking for those turning point moments and a lot of specific details because that specificity not only makes for a good story, but it also enhances the coherence of the story according to the research, and that's good for us too. So that's just a brief overview.
Well, that's a great overview, and I see that that some of the points have been put into the chat. So looking for turning point moments, and I think one illness is a biographical disruption is a wonderful concept, and I can see why you would totally be interested in that. Were there common themes that you see across the stories?
Well, I mean, there are those themes that I just mentioned that we're actually looking for and trying to develop further. And so you see in any given story all of those different themes and different degrees of them, and we just sort of pull for those and develop them out more.
Right, of course, yeah, and these are incredibly complex stories.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to say, like, they're also not neat and clean and simply redemptive. They're not. They're real. They're tough. They're painful sometimes, and that's part of the process. They have to be authentic and real. They're not going to be all redemptive, but there can be redemptive threads, even if it's not a redemptive
Mm-hmm.
experience overall. Although I will always say, like, even in a terminal illness, there are redemptive threads. I mean, we see in Caroline's story that even though obviously this is a very challenging diagnosis, she made a lot of really great changes and shifted her life and came to appreciate things more. And so that's redemptive, I would say, but not everything is cleanly redemptive.
Right, right. You had mentioned something about we were talking about questions and wondering about the audience. What does the audience think about the character of the teller's illness, the character of cancer? Can you
Yeah.
speak?
So I mean, we sort of think of the illness as a character entering into the story. So it sort of goes back to what I said about, the stories being relational, that we're all sort of co-constructing our stories all the time. And these people we meet, or whether it's a character like cancer entering our lives, our stories are going to shift and change. Um, and so it's going to be different for everybody, what kind of character cancer plays in their life. But it is, I do think, I like thinking about it as a new character in the story, and how does that co-construct the story that's going to come after that diagnosis.
And you said you do this, you've done it in halls, so people present their stories to their family and the people that they invite, and you do it where several stories are told at once on an evening?
Yeah, typically we have two storytellers. We have done it in private homes where people just invite their family and friends, but we've also done it in large gatherings. When Caroline shared with us in Boston, she did it at a public venue for the public radio, which was open to the public. We've done them for hospital departments. So all sorts of different gatherings. One of the models that we have that I think is particularly interesting to me is a patient and a provider model. So we have a patient storyteller and a provider storyteller. They are in a therapeutic relationship already as patient and doctor. And we have them each write their stories separately using a slightly different guide for each of them. And then they come together and share, having not heard each other's stories, and then dialogue with each other. And that's pushing the boundaries a little bit in a way that medicine in general makes taboo. Doctors are told, like, not to tell anything personal and keep the boundary. And I do think we have to respect boundaries. But I also think, since I've been a patient, I have become more fluid in those boundaries. And I think it's really nice to see a little humanness in the providers. And so in this, we create a safe space to do it with the provider sharing and the patient sharing. And yes, the provider shares personal details, but not in a way that's going to compromise or make the patient feel burdened by it. And we're careful about that. But there is something really powerful that happens when sort of the humanness of both is celebrated and showcased. And it does then insert something into that relationship that is carried forward and changes that patient-doctor relationship. And I think those are strained patient and provider relationships. I shouldn't say patient-doctor, patient-provider. They're strained in the current system. So we've had a lot of success with this model to sort of just humanize it for everybody. Doctors are unhappy with the system as it is and are humans, and patients are often unhappy, and to sort of tap into that shared humanity, I think, is important.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's so wonderful that you did. Now, how does someone get involved? Can anyone get involved in the Health Story Collaborative?
Yeah, so I mean, we have limited ability to do the stories with everybody who contacts us, but we do collect stories, and we have a blog, so we collect written stories as well. We do sometimes just audio recorded stories, and then we do these live events. Now that we've gotten into the virtual space of doing them, we're not as limited by space. Before, we were just doing them locally because we were doing them in person. So while we can't do it with everybody just because of our bandwidth, we're a very small staff, we always welcome people to send through our website an email if they have a story that they want to share, and to pitch it to us. And you know, when we have two storytellers, they may be two people with the same diagnosis who don't know each other, or they may be people that know each other that have the same diagnosis, or there's some connection usually in terms of the theme of what the diagnosis is, or a connection between the two people that know each other. Like, we've also had a mother and a son. The mother had malignant melanoma. The son was a medical student. So that was another sort of interesting dyad we had. So yeah, we're open to it. You can contact us through our website. And we occasionally do trainings that are more accessible to bigger groups, where we talk about sort of these narrative themes and train people in this healing story sessions model so that they can bring it into their own communities and their own work and adapt it however they choose, but base it on our model that we have developed.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you. Stephanie Weissman asked, have you seen the book Radical Remission?
No.
I have heard of it. But I have to be honest, so part of like my creating hope for myself was, I really, sort of speaking to what Annie was saying, I had some instincts about this, and that reading anyone else's story actually felt potentially damaging / like it just, I couldn't develop hope based on what someone else had gone through, knowing that my story was my own. And also my theory, I don't know that this is true, but this is how I felt about my cancer, is like, okay, my cancer are like my glial cells, like my DNA decided to freak out and do this thing. So someone else having even a glioblastoma, like, that's their own cells, right? That's like their own situation. They're like, so for me, that's also why I don't really like giving advice. People come to me asking for advice, like, so tell me what you did now. And so I tell them that, you know, what I do think is really important is to, you know, find hope, but to be yourself. Like, don't let the cancer take you away from you, because that's the only thing that you have to fight. So this is a long-winded way of saying I know of books. I know of lots of books. I just don't read them. So just because I don't have space to hold other people's tragic cancer stories or hope in my life. I mean, and that sounds awful or ignorant or whatever, but it was a hard decision, but it's just like, I have to follow what feels good for me. And I find other people's, it can be very like enticing, but I try really hard to keep it quiet in my head.
Well, having a diagnosis for anyone is, very upsetting, and generally people want to help, and they start giving you literature and books and links and everything, and it's already overwhelming. So it's nice. Sometimes you just have to rein it in and make those decisions. Certainly in telling your story, because it's yours, and that not only changes your life, but it changes the life of the person you're interacting with. Are they understanding you in a different way? They're listening to your full story uninterrupted, and that makes a difference, don't you think?
Yeah, definitely. Like I said before, the telling a story, certainly writing about my story, which I do often. It's a way of showing people that whatever you think a dying person is or a sick person is, it might not be that, and actually casting them as that is awful. Because like, I'm a person who like makes cookies and cakes for, like I'm like believe that things, I'm like very cheerful and funny and nice. And so like having cancer and walking up to people and having them cry at me was like a very, very strange thing. And so it was always hard for me being like, okay. And I had to learn like, okay, that's you. That is you doing your thing. I wish people could get better at that and not try and hand that to me, because I'm also dealing with so much, So writing and having these spaces as like a platform to show that it doesn't look like what you think it does, and to give the space for that so that the person can feel empowered, is important.
Yes, I know Annie said over the years, well, Annie, your finished audio stories have been featured on Boston's local NPR station, WBUR, and you said you've seen firsthand how the process of storytelling is in itself therapeutic for both storytellers and listeners.
Absolutely. Yeah. So actually, I mean, I just have a lot of thoughts going through my head, but I can relate to what Caroline was saying about sometimes not wanting to hear those stories. Like when I was first diagnosed, I wanted to hear them, but I wanted to be able to control it. I didn't want to go into a support group where I might get hijacked by some story that I didn't think I could handle at the time. But I wanted to hear sort of like true stories with like an arc. And maybe it wasn't even MS. Like probably I didn't even want to hear about MS. I wanted to hear other stories. How do people just have a challenging diagnosis, move forward, create a life, even if they had disability, even if they didn't get cured, whatever. And I couldn't really find those on the internet. And that's sort of what I was seeking before I had sort of fully owned my diagnosis. And so I decided to start collecting the stories from other patients with other diagnoses so I could make that listening library available. So it was really that first was motivating. But then in doing the collection of the stories, what I realized is that, in fact, probably what was more empowering was the process that people went through in the sharing, and sort of going through the work of creating an authentic narrative, crafting it, having it then shared and witnessed, is really powerful. So the listening is powerful. Yes, research supports that, but I think even more powerful is the process of engaging with the story and then being witnessed and sharing it. But as Caroline said, I think being able to have the space to do that without interruption and have your story be your story is powerful.
Thank you. Thank you both so much for being here. Before the time, as I say, always passes quickly. But before we conclude, is there anything else on your mind that you'd like to share?
I just want to say thank you to Caroline. She's amazing. And it's, for me, doing this work is such a gift because I get to meet people like Caroline who really inspire me, and it really feeds me and is meaningful. So thank you, Caroline.
Well, thank you. Honestly, being able to tell my story, like I said, and you make that happen, and giving people a voice, and also just showing that there's like humanity in life in a different way that people expect, that it's not all scary, and that we're not like shouldn't be shunned from society or behind closed doors or whatever it is that people expect. I don't know. And this is like whatever, I wrote a book, but this is the book. It's called Lasting Love. It's probably backwards for you guys. That occurs to me.
Oh, it looks good.
Oh, good. So yeah, it's a very sweet book. It's like very much a chunk of me. So yeah, it's out there.
Your children, that's wonderful. Good. We will look for it. And I think they're posting that along with your web address in the chat. And I know when you go to your website and it says right for the Health Collaborative website, you are not alone. Health Story Collaborative believes in story sharing for health. So audience members and all of us will explore the site, listen to stories, and consider crafting and sharing your own. With a very special thank you to Dr. Annie Brewster and Caroline Wright, and a shout out to Delphine Liston, who assisted in making this gathering possible.
Absolutely.
Also.
Well, thank you again to MarshStream and to your organization, to soloarts Heal. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're so welcome. And we appreciate you inviting us into the world of the Health Story Collaborative. So the audience can look for this and other Solo Arts Heal shows and more at themarsh.org and on our MarshStream and YouTube platform. And I want to tell you that next week on Solo Arts Heal, join us for Skin by Hope Singson, which explores the creativity and courage it takes to heal in a frank and funny queer love story with music, where two things threaten a grad student's dissertation on Virginia Woolf, her hot new girlfriend, and the echoes of her own dark past. And we'll be talking about all that. We have a wonderful program. Thank you, Annie and Caroline and the Marsh from Bridget Bonner. And I thank you all. Thanks again to the Health Story Collaborative, MarshStream producers Kristen, Brianna, artistic director Stephanie Weissman, of course, and always to our Zoom and YouTube audiences. We're all in this together. Kristen?
How do I describe my journey with
your mother, who takes care of you, who takes you to the doctor when you're sick? Your mother.
Good morning, New York. Buenos dias. It's me. What's up?
We went out for lunch at a sushi place where she tried sushi for the first time and she liked it.
I see that change can happen. I know things can shift and change for good.
I am dizzily dazzled with stars in my eyes.
Same level as I broke my neck. But he's not getting the same return of function I am.
And I don't want any of your smart aleck sex talk that I usually get when I get...
This is beyond the marsh because what you're doing is planting beautiful seeds for artists to grow.